I'd like to now invite our next panel to join us. We actually, so we've got Mark Booten, who is I'm going to sit here, Mark. Why don't I go ahead and sit down? We've got Mark Booten, who is the CEO of the National Health Council. We've got Marcus Wilson here, who's the president of Health Corps. And hello, Dr. von Eschenbach, Andy von Eschenbach, who is with us, president of Samaritan Health Initiatives and also former FDA commissioner and former NCI director. And we've got a couple of folks on Skype because Reagan was closed this morning with our storm. Dr. Hernandez, do we have you on Skype?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, fantastic technology. So we've got Dr. Hernandez, who comes to us from Duke. He's the director of the Health Services Outcomes Research at Duke Clinical Research Institute. He's joining us by Skype. And David Madigan, are you with us? He might be on mute, but I think we were able to get Skype to work for David Madigan.
Yes, I'm here. Good morning.
Oh, there he is.
Good morning.
Coming out of Providence and coming out of North Carolina. We had some trouble getting into Reagan this morning. David Madigan is the Executive Vice President and Dean of Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Columbia University. So welcome. So why are we here? As Senator Frist talked about, we released a report back in July, a letter to Chairman Alexander and Ranking Member Murray to outline a set of 19 recommendations for medical innovation action in our country. And we were really delighted to see a lot of those move forward in the package, and we're hoping that things move here in the next couple of weeks. One of those recommendations, and it was actually the first one, 1.1, if you read our report, it was called Advancing the Generation and Use of Real-World Evidence. And that's something that's actually in the 21st Century Cures Act, but it's not in the Senate package. Our hope is through conference, when things come together, that this can be a key part of it. And we think it's really important, and our panelists are going to talk about why it is important. I encourage you, for folks online, I know we've got a lot of folks joining by web on this rainy, stormy day, and those in the room, to take a look at the report. We're going to explore some of the key aspects of it. But before we do, we've got some time to really probe the issues. I'd like to go to each of my panelists, maybe starting with Mark Booten on my left. If you could share a little bit about yourself and your interest in cell therapy, and then we'll get some general insights, and then we'll dive into the detail.
So thank you, Janet, and let me thank the Bipartisan Policy Commission for their leadership on this. Senator Frist, Congressman Gordon, you guys have done a terrific job on really framing out the issues. And I think from a patient perspective, there's huge opportunity. So I am the CEO of the National Health Council, which is an umbrella organization of the nation's leading patient advocacy organizations, groups you would all know, like American Heart Association and many others. We also include membership across the entire health spectrum. So we have the biopharmaceutical sector, we have the device diagnostic, generic, payer community, provider community, all in membership. So we focus in on things that are important to people with chronic diseases and disabilities, but we do it through the lens of being informed by all stakeholders. Our interest in this is quite simple. We really want to ensure that people with chronic disease and disabilities have the best information, best evidence, best treatments so that they can make the most informed decisions about their care. And I'll come back to it in a moment, but there's something I want to pick up on that I think is really critical that the previous panel had. We in the United States have a history at being great at innovation. And we also have a culture of focusing in on being the best. And that's really exciting. The downside to being the best is it sometimes stymies innovation. And I'll give you a great example. When you look at the manufacturing of medicines, in the 80s, there used to be a prize for the best manufacturing plant. Now, this was not focused on the innovation of developing medicines. It was focused on who could manufacture the medicine the best. And they did it for 5 years. And 5 years afterwards, all 5 of those manufacturing plants were out of business. And they did an analysis to understand why. And the reason why was, if you're the best, you don't want to innovate. You don't want to change. You're already the best. Why would you do things differently? We have been the best at innovation for a long time. But the environment has changed. Science has changed. It's given us huge new opportunities to drive health forward for more than 133 million people with chronic diseases and disabilities. We can't focus on being the best. We have to continually challenge ourselves to do things differently and to incorporate new information, new technology. Real-world evidence is the perfect example of that.
Thanks, Mark. Dr. von Eschenbach.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks for reminding the audience that I'm a recovering federal employee. But the most important part of who I am is I'm a physician. And I think that's what bonds us and binds us all together, is that no matter what our backgrounds, no matter what our roles, the one thing that we're all totally, completely focused on is that patient, that human being who's suffering and distressed and maybe even dying. And as a physician, I knew that there were certain formulas, a certain diagnosis demanded a certain kind of treatment. But what we really had to do was understand that every single patient that we're dealing with was in some way different. And so physicians, like myself, like Dr. Frist, forever have been challenged with what is the best treatment for this particular patient that's before me right now. And so we tried to learn as much about that specific patient. We were using real-world evidence. We were using their whole story in addition to that formula that we had learned in medical school. We've gotten a lot more sophisticated about how to extract that kind of information, and family history is now being supplanted by, I can do your genome. But the principle's still the same. We need that data. We need that information. We can call it now personalized medicine or precision medicine, but it's really the basis and the principle of what we've been trying to do from day one. Get the right treatment for the right patient for the right reason. And so why am I here today? Because what's getting in the way of physicians and others caring for patients being able to do that is we need to shape policies that are going to enable us to use these new technologies, these new sources of data and information, whether it's the information about the variation in the patient, or the variation in their disease, or the variation in what kinds of treatments are available. All that needs to be a part of our commitment to really passionately caring for every single person out there that is suffering and perhaps even dying from a disease that today we can do something about. So thank you for including me.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Marcus, some general insights.
Sure, happy to use it. Janet, thank you thank you to you and the BPC for having me as a part of the panel here. I'm a clinical pharmacist by training, and I started my career within a group practice in northern Delaware, working with a group of physicians and nurse practitioners. And my role within that group was really in clinical decision support. And my job was to, on a given patient for a given condition and given choices that were being made, to try to pull together all of the information I could, the existing evidence, and work with those practitioners to apply that evidence to that individual sitting in front of us. Most of the time we were doing that, what we found out early on is that even though we pulled together all the relevant evidence we could, the challenge we had is that the individual sitting in front of us, more often than not, differed from the population that was studied in the clinical trial. And the circumstances that we were working within and that patient was being managed within were also very different environment than the environment in which the clinical trials were done. And they varied in very, very important, very relevant ways. And so for us, we began to be really challenged with making informed, evidence-based decisions. And we looked at this as saying that there's a fundamental issue in this, It's not just a matter of good clinical decision support about being able to pull together all the existing evidence that's out there, and that's a big challenge on the everyday decision making that's done at the patient level. But it's also in having the right types of evidence generated in the first place that we could apply. So it's a marriage of those two pieces. And so I began a personal mission at that point. And now 20 years later, after we started Health Corps, we're still working in that same mission to try to close that gap in evidence, to generate more relevant evidence for decision makers to make better decisions. And the decision makers are broad. It's the innovators, the life sciences industry, others that are doing the innovation. It's the regulators that really need to make informed decisions. It's the prescribers themselves. It's the policymakers that decide what's going to be paid for them and in what form. And then it's the patients themselves. And so we think those are, for us, it's become a really important challenge and mission for us, and will be for a while. So thank you.
And we're going to talk a lot more about the generalizability of randomized controlled trials. I wonder if, Dr. Hernandez, could you say just a couple of remarks about your insights? And we wish you were here, but...
No, I wish I was there too, so thanks for having me here. And so I'm a cardiologist and actually see patients before heart transplants and after heart transplants. So I have some common things and experiences with us in our FRIS. And one thing that has come up over and over and over is that we have a parallel universe for how we care for patients versus how we do research. And so it's highly redundant in terms of we have patients who are walking every day through the healthcare systems with questions, often getting information online now without the right answers that they need. And then we don't take advantage of patients that are similar as they come through to learn how to be better for the next patient. And so as we're doing clinical trials, we often create a system to do the trial, we break it down, and then rebuild it. Where now we're actually on a cusp where we can actually take advantage of electronic health records, real-world data, people-generated data to deliver real-world evidence. And that way, patients are coming across actually have better answers, and we as clinicians can provide better guidance. And so really trying to bring those two worlds together to have more informed decisions is a key goal. And just as an example of that is what we've created with what's called the CoreNet, uniting patients, clinicians, and health systems. But there are still barriers to doing pragmatic clinical trials that need to be resolved.
And I know we're going to talk more about pragmatic trials as we get into it. And then finally, if I could turn it over to David Madigan, maybe share a little bit about your background, and then we'll get into the discussion.
Sure. And thank you very much for having me. I'm so sorry I'm not there. So I'm a statistician. I've been working with large-scale healthcare data for about a decade, with a goal of figuring out how to generate accurate and reproducible evidence from large-scale healthcare data. This work mostly took place under the auspices of a project called OMOP, the Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership, which was a 5-year project. It was a public-private partnership between the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry. The researchers involved in that have essentially regrouped as part of a new project called Odyssey, OHDSI.org is the website, the Observational Healthcare Data Science and Informatics initiative. There are about 100 researchers involved, and they're all over the world. It's truly a global research effort. Many of the researchers have they set up databases, electronic health record databases or claims databases, and in some cases genomics data that have been mapped to a common data model, so we can run analysis across a global network that now has about 700 million patients in the network, so multiple years of medical records for 700 million patients all over the world. This is a non-trivial fraction of the world's population, so the number of patients represented in these databases is no longer the rate-limiting step. What is the limiting step is how do we generate accurate, reliable, reproducible evidence from these databases. Quite a bit of progress has been made in the last few years by our group and by other groups around the world. But we have a lot of work to do. Just to give you one quick example to make this concrete, and it's actually one of the more straightforward challenges, but still it's a challenge, which is in these databases there are errors, so that the data are not necessarily gathered for clinical purposes. So just because you see an ICD-9 code for an MI, for example, does not mean that the patient necessarily had an MI. The code might be there in error for various reasons. The methods that we're using to generate evidence from these databases, for the most part, assume that such problems simply do not exist. And as a consequence, the evidence you get out at the other end is basically not very reliable. Mm-hmm. So I could give you a half a dozen other kind of challenges that face us. So, to me, we're at a moment of huge promise and potential for truly personalized medicine. But we have quite a bit of work to do in terms of methods for generating that evidence.
Thank you. So I'd like to just check in with folks here in the audience. I mean, by show of hands, how many of you are familiar with what real-world evidence is? Okay, so we've got a pretty low understanding of what it is. And it seems like it's a pretty technical concept. And I thought what we would do, Andy, maybe if I could start with you. I think Senator Frist mentioned that we spend now on average about $2 billion in 10 years to get a drug to market. And I know that's a big focus of Chairman Alexander, who was with us this morning. So when the rubber hits the road, what is real world evidence? And how can it, and more importantly, so maybe let me just, real world evidence for purposes of our report and our discussion is data. It's usually electronic data. It is electronic data. We've got lots more of it because we've invested more than $30 billion into electronic health records and doctors and hospitals' offices, and we're also monitoring ourselves. We've got claims databases. So, question for you, Dr. von Eschenbach, why are we spending so much, $2 billion, 10 years? And what role can real-world evidence play in sort of helping to address that problem?
Well, the process from going from the discovery of a molecule to the delivery of a medicine in the market, if you will, that process has gotten increasingly more complex. The nature of the medications, the molecules themselves, have gotten to be much more complex. Their application is much more complex. And so what we've been always doing is trying to gather a sufficient amount of evidence along that process, both its preclinical phase as well as its clinical phase, enough evidence that we could know with some confidence how that was going to perform when it became available to large populations of patients. So in a way, we've used, I'll be a little pejorative, unreal evidence. In terms of the fact that we gathered that evidence primarily through a very disciplined, very highly selective process of a clinical trial. So we were very careful about who we allow into that trial because we're trying to reduce the complexity as much as possible, eliminate as many variables as we can so that when we see a difference or an outcome, we have some degree of confidence and comfort that it's due to the medicine and not something else. But what we're finding is increasingly that those clinical trials don't reflect necessarily the real world, i.e. the general population of what's happening when you can't control for all those variables. And so if we're going to continue to be confident and comfortable about our decisions as to the value of that drug, its effectiveness, its relative risk, et cetera, we need to expand the information that we're gathering to not only include, in many cases, the disciplined, rigorous selection that we use in clinical trials, but to also observe in real time what's happening in the rest of the world, the larger population. We could not do that before because we didn't have the tools. And today we do, but we haven't fully implemented them, we haven't fully embraced them, but it's a process. And so just to sum up very quickly, a long answer to a short question, it's going to become increasingly more complex and increasingly more difficult. And if we don't allow the opportunity to embrace additional data and information that we'll call real world, together with what we've been doing traditionally, it's only going to get worse rather than better.
So Marcus, you published a blog this week. I think it was Monday. You talked about the gold standard. Could you sort of, again, recognizing the number of hands that went up, very few, about this issue, can you sort of expand upon the gold standard and how real-world evidence helps?
Sure. We often refer to the randomized clinical trial as the gold standard, and it truly is. I mean, it is the gold standard in the sense of doing what Dr. von Eschenbach just mentioned, of establishing causality, meaning that the intervention itself, the technology, the drug, biotechnology, device, is what led to the outcome we measured and not some other random event that we don't understand. And so we control those clinical trials in such a way that the internal validity is very strong in that sense. The sacrifice we make, however, is when we look to apply that evidence that's generated from the clinical trial to other populations, we really see that those populations vary so meaningfully in many cases that we really don't know what we're doing. We don't know if it works or if it's safe in that population. So we think about it, clinical trials really are really good at telling us if something works, but it's not really good at telling us in whom it works, right? And so if you think about healthcare decisions or risk-benefit decisions always, it's not about risk, it's not about benefit, it's about the balance between the two. What we really need to understand better is how that plays out in various subpopulations of patients that are very similar in very meaningful ways and different than other populations. And I think real-world evidence designs have the potential to help us get there. And I want to make an important distinguish our point about the term real-world data, the data that's mentioned by David and is often talked about, these big data sets. That's data. That's not evidence, it's data, right? So what we do with it is try to generate evidence. And when we think about mining existing databases to generate evidence, that's one type of design. It's typically observational research because you're using data that was captured for other purposes and you're using it to try to assume we know what's happening. And that's one form, and that's appropriate for certain types of evidence development. But there's other types of real-world evidence development as well, and those are the types of designs that we look at where we want to very closely mimic the real world, but we're still doing it, we're able to introduce randomization, we're able to do standardized data collection where we have to in a way that gets some of those great values that a randomized clinical trial has, but at the same time also gives us great value from an observational perspective. So you're blending the worlds together. So I want to make sure we're not looking at real-world evidence as one type of evidence development. There's a very broad spectrum of it, and it's fit to purpose. We have to think about and the disease state we're looking at, the drug we're looking at, the population we're looking at, and try to make sure that design fits that. And so we're trying to get the balance between internal validity and generalizability in the right place. So I think that's a really important distinction.
And for the people in the audience and those on the web, so if you look at it this way, so we've got our randomized controlled trials. Those are the gold standard. More than 50 years have supported regulatory decision-making at the FDA. And we've got all this new data, right? And so traditionally looking at observational studies. And now we're beginning to see some new models. And Dr. Hernandez, Adrian, I'm going to tee you up for this. Some folks are looking at ways to use real-world data and apply randomization techniques in the real world in order to develop evidence. And Adrian, or Dr. Hernandez, if you could, what is a pragmatic controlled trial? And again, there were, checking the hands in the room. We've got, folks don't know a lot about this, so maybe explaining it, in a way that a health policy wonk like me could understand. How about?
Sure. So just as Marcus said, so we are now seeing where the worlds of routine data that's generated as part of healthcare can actually be used for informing decision making. But an important feature that is often needed to ensure that you have the right answer is to ensure that both groups, for example, two different options, have appropriately been evaluated. And so in order to do that, the safest way is actually to insert randomization. And so what one can do is actually use the data that's actually being generated as part of routine healthcare, but essentially insert randomization.
We might have lost you. There you are.
So that it's part of clinical practice. So, okay, sorry. So what I was saying is, in terms of being able to do a pragmatic randomized clinical trial, is simply allowing patient experience and their clinical care to be done as routinely considered for their medical conditions, but actually inserting randomization so that for a given choice of therapy, there's an equal odds for given that two different choices.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
And therefore you can have
Okay, we're having some technical difficulties. While we're waiting for Dr. Hernandez to come back, so Mark, you represent thousands and thousands of patients. All of this real-world data, what does it mean? What does it mean? And I know we're really grateful to have a number of patients in the room.
Yeah, so I'm curious. I know we have some patient representatives in the room. Can I get you to raise your hand? Excellent. We have reporters in the room, I'm guessing? No hands, no? I have a couple of reporters. How many of you live inside Washington, D.C.? Oh, so we have a lot of you outside of D.C. How many of you consider yourself a healthcare wonk? I know there are more of you than that, so I think
Very
a few of them.
few for David and Andrea.
Let me drive this point home. The National Health Council, with our patient advocacy organizations, represent 133 million people with one or more chronic disease or disability in the United States alone. Think about that. That's more than a third of the population. Most of these people have more than one chronic diseases. And if you were to go to them and ask, and we actually do this research quite often in our policy work, and said, what is a clinical trial? I think, well, it's what we use to gather information so that medicines come to market. If you were then, in a deliberative way, through a focus group or deliberative jury, explain to them that the point of that is to determine safety and efficacy and to eliminate all the other factors that occur in real life, they would think you were crazy. And they would say, of course that doesn't happen. And then you explain to them, no, actually, that's really how we do it. There are good reasons for why we do it, don't get me wrong, but that's how we do it. They would be absolutely stunned. And then if you explain to them, well, we have an opportunity to do something called real-world evidence. We're going to gather that data that actually tells us what happens in the real world. So that when you take that medicine and you happen to be an African American living in a rural setting of lower economic social status, and you have two other chronic diseases, you have a job, you have a family, you have all the stressors that we have, and that product might not work very well for you. And in fact, it might not just not work for you, it might actually harm you. And yet we're still prescribing it to you. They would be, well, of course we're taking that data into consideration. We're already doing this. I guarantee you that the average person would think that this is already happening.
Yes.
And yet we've built up a system, again, focused on being the best. Again, I think that's a good thing, but you have to get out of your own way. We have to build the pathways to incorporate this information, whether it be from big data sets, and I think we do have some work to do. Or if it's as Marcus describes, sort of stalled on your name, I apologize, you've got to be able to develop mechanisms that are fit for purpose to really understand this. We now have the capacity to do it. We don't have the policies in place to promote it. And what we're saying in this report is let's drive the policy so that we can capture the science and data to do what the average person thinks we're already doing.
So, Andy, yeah, could you?
I just add a couple points to that really very insightful explanation. One thing I think that people don't generally understand and appreciate is that there's another aspect to these clinical trials that's called the power. You have to power them by having a sufficient number of people so that you're confident that what outcome you observe is in fact valid. I'll put it that way. There are some issues and some questions that can't be answered in that context because the power to do it would require so many people that it's just not practical. And so having a different way of being able to gather evidence, gather data that can then be analyzed in a way to produce evidence is increasingly more important, and certainly for very specific kinds of trials. And the other thing that I think we have to admit at this point, and why we so desperately need policies that can shape the evolution and development of this, is it's not a turnkey operation. It's just not, oh, tomorrow we're going to do this and it's going to be all wonderful. It's going to be iterative and it's going to be developmental. But it's clear that we have to embrace it and have to begin that developmental iterative process to integrate it more and more into our ability to care for patients and to make appropriate decisions about what's in their best interest, whether it's the regulation of a drug or whatever.
So Andy, we're going to start talking about some of the building blocks on how we get there. But Mark teed up policy. We talk a little bit in our report about the situations in which real-world evidence can be used. Could you share some of those ideas? You know, we've heard a little bit about label expansions. Or Marcus, do you want to? Is that?
Sure.
Andy?
They can be used. Well, we have to think about.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that there's no prohibition to using it necessarily. When you talk to a regulator in the U.S., they say, well, we don't say you can't use it, but there's a difference in that and really supporting or outlining or advocating its use in the appropriate circumstances. And I think it goes back to a lot of what Mark mentioned earlier. You know, when you're the best, you often become a little bit numb to innovation to some extent. And I was talking earlier about to one of the folks in the audience here in preparation for the meeting, and we were talking a little bit about this whole term inertia. And I think inertia is created by that framework that Mark outlined so well. And I think what we're trying to do is move from a policy perspective, move folks forward and get rid of some of that inertia so that we can innovate, we can become more progressive to really answer the questions the right way. So if we think about the uses of it, I think it's an incremental approach, right? We have to crawl, walk, run in doing this, and we have to build on the power and the excellence that's in clinical trials and add other types of designs to that. So label expansions is a really good example of that. Looking at new indications for existing drugs. And in those cases, why that's such an important starting point is that we already understand pretty well enough about the product to understand its safety, which is really one of your biggest measures in all of this. You really want to make sure we're not increasing the risk for patients and exposing them to the drugs. So we want to make sure that we're starting at a point of understanding of where we stand with products that are already on the market. We understand the safety profile much better. So in doing that, in building out and trying to understand better now the effectiveness in those real-world settings, I think that's a good starting point. I think we eventually, though, need to get, as we learn, as we build our tools, as we develop the methods that David and Adrian talked about before, then I think we have to expand that even further into the developmental process so that we can learn much faster what works and what's safe, and how that varies across different populations, as we talked about before.
I'd like to build on something that Marcus said, and for those of you, when you flip through the report, and we talk about real-world evidence. We interviewed 30 experts who are in the back of the report. They're listed, but we didn't seek consensus on where people wanted to go. But I think, based on all of the discussions, there was a great deal of interest in using real-world data to develop evidence. No one thought that the gold standard would ever go away. Randomized controlled trials are really important, but there were a lot of ideas on how real-world evidence could augment randomized controlled trials to improve that generalizability. And it seemed that there were a handful of areas where efficacy and safety have already been demonstrated where they could help to generalize. So that was an important finding of the report that we talk about. And then we sort of share how might we get there incrementally.